Good afternoon, friends. I'm going to tell you a story. It's not really a story about me, but it's a story about how I came to be who I am. It's the story of Vincent Chin. Some of you already know this story. It's a compelling story. It's a story that for so many, it's what made us realize we were Asian Americans. And for me, the story of Vincent Chin is intertwined with my own personal story. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. That's the logo of the Detroit Tigers baseball team. Detroit is a magnificent wreck of a city, and it's the backdrop and setting for this story. And I'll take some time to establish the scene, because for so many young people, the next generation leaders, you weren't even alive when all of this happened. But I was. I was a teenager. And the memory is as vivid to me now as when all of this unfolded in 1982. Let me start, though, by explaining, for those of you who don't know, who Vincent Chin was. He was an ordinary guy. He's Chinese American. He's 27 years old. He's a civil rights martyr, an icon. He was brutally bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat because he was Asian American. Chin was not the model minority. He was salt of the earth. He had been adopted, actually, by a Chinese-American couple who couldn't conceive. And he probably drove too fast, drank too much, hung out too late. He dropped out of college, although at the time of his death, he'd gone back to technical school. He was going to be a draftsman. And he was known as a little bit of a hothead, a guy with a temper, but a friendly guy. He knew everyone within the downtown Chinatown crowd, the ethnic, blue-collar, laundry-owning, restaurant-owning, hard-working, blue-collar folks that made up much of the urban ethnic core that too often we neglect and overlook. What happened to Chin on June 19th, 1982, is as he was out for his bachelor's party, he was going to celebrate, he'd met a nice young Chinese-American lady, and he did what any all-American guy would do. He went to celebrate with a bunch of his friends. He was no saint. They went to a seedy part of town, to a strip club, because, well, that's what guys do for a night out for their bachelor's party. And there he encountered two other men, two gentlemen who were Caucasian, who were auto workers, a father and a stepson, actually, also out carousing, who, when they looked at Chin, started to use some racial slurs. The same sorts of epithets that I used to hear as the common childhood cruelty on the playground. Many of you have heard these words hurled at you as well. Chink, Jap, and so on. And then, according to witnesses, one of the men shouted at Chin or in his direction. You have to pardon this language, but this is a quote. "You little motherfucker, it's because of you motherfuckers that we're out of work." Meaning that it didn't matter to his attackers that Chin was Chinese, not Japanese, that he was an American, not a foreigner, and that, like them, he was salt of the earth, just a guy, working class guy, feeling the pinch of economic anxiety, but the hope and happiness of his new life to come. Before the evening was over, using a baseball bat they had in the trunk of their car, taking repeated swings so hard that, according to the off-duty cop who stopped the brutal beating, it looked like the assailant wanted to hit a home run, they had literally cracked open Chin's skull, and with blood and cerebral matter and spinal fluid pooling onto the pavement beneath him, he crumpled, uttered the last words in Cantonese, "It's not fair," and then passed into a coma from which he never recovered. Before I explain how the death of this individual was the birth of a movement, let me pull back and tell you a little more about my hometown of Detroit and about the era of 1982. So this is the downtown railroad station, which has been abandoned for a couple of generations now. It's an iconic building, both in its heyday when trains used to run there, and now as this symbol of the Rust Belt, of decay, Teenagers get drunk and engage in what's called urban spelunking, as in exploring caves, but they go to abandoned buildings like this because that's what Detroit is now. It wasn't always that way. This was a city, the Motor City, that was the fourth largest in the United States. Some of you in the room who are a little older may remember when it was a city that mattered. It was a city as important as Los Angeles. It was culturally important with the Motown sound. It was economically important. It was politically important. The Democratic candidate for president always goes to Detroit to march in the Labor Day parade because of the importance of the United Auto Workers as a union. But it's not called the Motor City for no reason. I grew up there because my father worked at Ford Motor Company, what was once part of the Big Four, GM, Ford, Chrysler, and American Motors, headed by Mitt Romney's father, actually. So Detroit was dedicated to doing just one thing, and that was making cars. It was not economically diversified. And there's one other fact that you need to know that in contemporary California seems almost implausible, but there was a time when everybody drove an American car. I mean everybody. Your father, your grandfather, they were a Chevy guy or a Ford guy. They were loyal to a brand in a way that could not be imagined. In the United States, the Big Four had 99% market share. Sure, rich people had a Mercedes, hippies had a Volkswagen, but nobody drove what was derisively called Jap crap. A Honda, a Toyota, Subaru, a Datsun. People would have laughed at you. Those cars were small, they were ugly, but worst of all, they came from the Orient. And it was unheard of. Nobody bought cars like that because they were regarded not as symbols of quality, but remember, back then, made in Japan, made in Taiwan, made in Korea, that symbolized shabby, that you couldn't buy an American V8. The American iron that ruled the road. That, by the way, wasn't just here. If you went to Asia, if you go to China, even today, the Buick is the prestige car to have because that's what officials had back when automobiles had just been invented and were being imported into China. So around the world, if you acquired a Cadillac or a Lincoln, that didn't just mean that you had made it, it meant that your society had made it. That's what heads of state drove. So Detroit was mighty and it was proud. It was because of the manufacturing of cars. Everybody worked for the auto industry. It was dominant in a way that you can't imagine. Not even Hollywood here in Los Angeles has the same hold over a city. If you didn't work for a car company, your neighbor did, or they worked for a supplier. Their whole neighborhoods, this is even true today. I don't know if anyone here is from Detroit, but there are neighborhoods where most of the people work for a particular company. So there's a Ford neighborhood, there's a GM neighborhood, and so on. And so we were there because my father had the best job you could possibly have. This is when working at the at any auto company meant a job for life, meant pension and health care. So he worked at Ford, and that's why I grew up in Detroit. And even as a kid, I was born in the year of the riots, 1967, that marked the beginning of the end for the city. But really what undid it was the oil crisis. Some of you may remember this, 1973 and then again in 1979, when OPEC called an embargo and suddenly gas was so expensive it was rationed. You could only buy gas certain days depending on whether your license plate had an odd or an even digit at the end. People got into fistfights at the pump. Gas stations actually ran out because it was so expensive, so difficult to obtain gas. And that meant something happened. Suddenly, people wanted those little compact cars, the Honda Civic. Cars so small you could put two of them into a standard parking space. Remember, back then, a Cadillac was 22 feet long. Here in California, you still see some of these land yachts on the road. They're absurd, right? And they got 6 miles to the gallon. I'm not making that up. You can Google it and check. In contrast, you bought one of these Japanese cars, half the length, and no surprise, it got quadruple the gas mileage. So these cars started to come by the container ship load here into Los Angeles. People called it an economic Pearl Harbor. They said that this was a trade war. Remember the Japan bashing? And there was a real sense then that the East was ascendant, that This was the rise of the East, the decline of the West, that Japan Inc. was taking over. It wasn't just the cars coming, the Hondas and Subarus, the Toyotas and Datsuns. It was also that Japanese were buying things, buying sports teams, landmarks, major US companies, household brand names. So everyone here lived in the fear that someday the Japanese would take over. If you remember the Back to the Future movies, Michael J. Fox, in one of them, when he travels forward to the future, his boss is Japanese. And that's the real humiliation. His boss actually fires him by sending him a fax that says you're fired. So that shows the dystopian, terrible outcome if the future takes the wrong course. You're white and American, but you work for someone who's Japanese. And then there was a recession, all starting in the late 70s, but running into the 1980s. It was terrible. It was worse than what we've just been through. What I mean by that is if you remember the headlines from a couple years ago, 2011, 2012, they would say worst unemployment in 30 years. Right? What does that mean? That means around 81, 82, it was just as bad. In fact, it was worse. Double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment, but there was a catch. The catch is the United States was in the doldrums. It was suffering. It had reached a moment that was its low point since World War II, while its vanquished enemy of Japan was going gangbusters, doing as well as it could possibly be doing. The recession we just went through was global. Everybody suffered. But to set the stage for the Vincent Chin story, in this once mighty and proud city, it had been humbled because those cheap, ugly Japanese cars were being imported and people were forsaking their patriotic duty to go out and buy a Chrysler and instead preferring a Toyota. Let me now return to the story of Vincent Chin. It's no accident that this case occurred in Detroit in 1982. So with that backdrop, as I was explaining, Chin, he wasn't a great guy. He was no saint. And indeed, the defense lawyers in the case that would subsequently follow, they made an argument. I don't disagree with it at all. Their argument was, Chin was no saint. He was just like the perpetrators of the crime. That's true. There were heavy drinking hotheads, guys who hung out at strip clubs, a little disreputable. All right, I get that, except that Chin had different skin color, different texture of hair, different shape of eyes, and that made all the difference in the world. He was exactly like his attackers, except in his race. So that night when he was out celebrating, what happened, to add to the detail, the fight didn't just occur all at once. So there were the racial slurs. Oh, by the way, the attackers, they never for a moment denied they killed Chin. They always admitted it. They said, but they were no bigots. It was just a bar brawl. It's not a hate crime. It was just a fight among angry, intoxicated guys at a strip club. That's all it was. So the witnesses, not just Chin's buddies, he had 3 friends with him, but some of the dancers, they reported hearing those terms, chink, Jap, and a word you hardly even hear anymore that used to be used as a slur about people who are of Japanese descent, nip. Well, at one point, Chin apparently said, I'm not Japanese. And then he said something about, don't call me a little motherfucker, to which the other 2 guys said, little motherfucker, big motherfucker, what's the difference? We're all just motherfuckers. Now, they admitted they did use that kind of language all the time, but they didn't mean anything by it. According to their account, for no apparent reason, Vincent Chin got up out of his chair, went over and slugged one of them in the stomach, just for no reason. That was their story. Well, whatever happened, pretty soon these guys, they picked up chairs, they were swinging at each other, and the bouncers were about to throw them out. The stepson of the father and stepson duo, he got cut on his head, and he was bleeding. He had to go to the men's room to clean up. So they went out the parking lot, Chin and his 3 friends, the father and stepson. And Chin was willing to fight. He actually said, let's finish this. But the father and stepson, they went to their car and pulled out a baseball bat. And when Chin saw an angry, drunk guy coming at him with a baseball bat, he said, I'm not going to fight with a baseball bat. He was willing to fight if the bat were put down, but not someone who was armed when Chin wasn't. Well, the guy kept coming, so Chin took off running with one of his friends. And the fellow with the bat, he couldn't catch him. So he instead said, let's get this motherfucker instead, pointing at one of Chin's friends who was also of Asian descent. One of Chin's friends who was there was white, but two were of Asian descent. Well, they couldn't catch that guy either. So the father and stepson, they got back in their car. They started to drive around. This all happened just off of Woodward Avenue, major thoroughfare that connects the city to the suburbs. It was on a fine summer night after the Detroit Tigers had played a doubleheader. And so Chin actually had run a couple blocks to a McDonald's just down the street. And the father and stepson, they actually found a bystander. There was an African-American bystander, just a stranger to them. And they said to him, we'll pay you $20 to help us catch the Chinaman. We're going to bust some heads. Well, they drove around. For those of you who are lawyers or law students in the room, it's not clear how long they drove. 2 minutes, 20 minutes? That's an important detail. Because if they drove around long enough, that means they had time for premeditation. It means this was not just in the heat of the moment. They actually went and found Chin. And they did. They saw him at the McDonald's. They jumped out of the car. They grabbed the baseball bat. They went over to Chin. The stepson sort of got Chin in a bear hug or shoved him or something, got him out in the street. The father took that bat and started to swing, kept swinging. It wasn't until an off-duty cop who was working as a security guard at the McDonald's came out and drew his service revolver and ordered the beating to stop that the father dropped the gun. So Chin went to Henry Ford Hospital, not too far away, a few blocks away. The EMT who showed up on the scene knew he was a goner. He would later say to authorities, nobody survives a head wound like that. And so Chin was put on a respirator, and a few days later, because it was futile, there was nothing to be done, he was already brain dead, the family authorized that the plug be pulled. The guests who would have attended his wedding went to his funeral instead. That's not the end of the Vincent Chin story. That's actually just the beginning of it. I'll just tell you briefly a summary of what happened. There were all these witnesses. Dozens of people had seen this beating, so there was no question that it took place. So when the prosecution began, the criminal defense lawyers representing the father and stepson, they did what any smart criminal defense lawyers would do. I don't begrudge them. I'm a lawyer myself, so I understand. They counseled their clients, and they took a plea deal. They agreed to plead to manslaughter instead of murder. That was a pretty good deal because there was just no denying that using a baseball bat, they had killed someone. That's harder than just shooting them or stabbing them. They really put their muscle into this. So sober, dressed in their Sunday best, they went into court. And Detroit was then the murder capital of the United States. Just more murders there. Almost every day there was a murder. That the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office had a standard practice. If there was a plea deal, they didn't show up at the sentencing. They just couldn't. Their caseload was too heavy. So the judge didn't hear any of the background. No racial slurs, nothing. Was just told these are two fine, upstanding men. These things happen. So he sentenced the father and stepson who killed Vincent Chin by bludgeoning him to death, who witnesses said used racial slurs and then said, because of you motherfuckers, we're out of work. He sentenced these two gentlemen to probation for 3 years and a fine of $3,000 each. That moment is what gave rise to what had not been seen until very recently, never been seen before, which is a massive civil rights movement led by Asian Americans, but joined by so many others, whites, blacks, Hispanics, women's groups, labor groups, all astonished, shocked, outraged that you could kill someone in cold blood that way and just receive probation. So Asian Americans marched, they gave speeches, they wrote letters and op-eds, they They visited the Attorney General. They even sent telegrams to Washington, D.C., to the Department of Justice. This was one of the last great protests conducted by telegram. So that puts in a past era. And that hadn't been seen before. This is a photograph of one of the rallies. The banner being carried there says, "It's not fair." A group was formed called, those were Chin's last words, a group was formed called American Citizens for Justice. That title is very deliberate. This group, mainly Asian Americans, wanted to emphasize they were American citizens. They were not foreigners. And this moment in the book that I'm writing, I'm going to say this is when Asian Americans were born. There have been Asians in the United States now for 6 generations, but they weren't called Asian Americans. The term Asian American wasn't even invented until 1968. People would have called themselves Chinese or Japanese or Korean or maybe Chinese American. They were called Orientals or by worse names by their neighbors and coworkers, but they didn't assert themselves as Asian Americans. This movement was different. The immigrants came together with the native born. Because of the mistaken identity twice over, Chinese for Japanese, citizen for foreigner, because of what we've always been told, well, you all look alike. This also brought together a pan-Asian American coalition. It wasn't just one ethnic group. It was every Asian ethnicity, such as they were represented in the Detroit area. It was young and old. It was the Cantonese-speaking urban Chinese, as well as the Mandarin-speaking suburban professionals. So they marched, and they demanded that the federal government intervene. So that happened. This was also in a time before the concept of hate crime, which we're familiar with now, when that was all new, before that had really solidified. So the United States government sent in 2 federal prosecutors who retried these facts. Now, as some of you know, because of double jeopardy, you can't try a person twice for the same crime, and technically the federal government can try someone again, but they always make sure that it's for a different charge. So here, in the federal case, instead of showing that the 2 men had killed Vincent Chin, which they admitted, they had to show it was on account of race, that it was because of his skin color, his ethnicity, his origins, that's why they bludgeoned him to death. Despite everything, the stepson was acquitted, the stepfather was convicted, sentenced to 25 years. On appeal, the defense lawyers, again, great lawyers, argued first, Orientals are not covered by civil rights laws. That was their first argument. They lost that argument. Then they said that this trial had been unfair to the defendants. Why? Because of the protest, because of the publicity, because there wasn't due process. That was their claim. The community activists had coached witnesses, had tainted the juror pool, that there was too much media. So the case, the verdict was reversed and the case was remanded, sent back for another trial. The judge moved the venue to Cincinnati, Ohio, where of the people in the jury pool, 9 out of 10 said that they didn't even know someone of Asian descent. In 1987, it was retried, and the father who had been convicted was acquitted as well. He's still alive. He lives in Las Vegas. There were civil suits in which the Chin estate recovered because there was no dispute that the 2 men killed Chin. The most recent legal activity, less than a year ago in this case, was the father, the one swinging the baseball bat, moved to set aside the civil judgment, claiming he couldn't pay the millions of dollars of accumulated debt. The reason, by the way, he lives in Las Vegas is because it's easy to shelter your assets there. At least the judge there denied the motion, so there remains an outstanding debt. The judge in the state case, the one who had given probation to the 2 killers, would later say in television interviews that Asians should be grateful to him because he brought them together. That's certainly true. There's much more to this story, but we don't have enough time. Suffice it to say that for me, as for so many others, I know my friend Stuart Quo, for example, tells a story about how this case led him to found what is now Asian Americans Advancing Justice. For so many of us, this was the moment when we realized that you couldn't ignore these issues. I'll close with this thought. When I was a kid, teachers used to say to me, well, when someone teases you, just reply, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And even as a kid, I knew there was something wrong with that. First of all, because the words usually lead to the sticks and stones. But second of all, because, well, you hurt yourself all sorts of ways. You break a bone, and it's actually a source of pride, right? You get a cast, your friends write on it, and then you have a scar. That's really cool. You fly off the swing set, you knock your teeth out, you tumble downstairs, you have a high fever. You suffer grievous wounds that no adult could, and you bounce right back. But I'll tell you, even now when I'm walking down the street, and it happens, even here in California, someone rolls their window down and shouts something about go back to where you came from, or says chink, or jap, or gook. I'll tell you, that affects me more than someone punching me. I don't know why, I don't know if it's just me, but there's something about those formative years, about those experiences, about being marked as an outsider. It makes you stronger in some ways, but for me, what it convinced me of was the importance of us to organize, like these folks here, to march, to have banners, to do what they're doing, because you won't always win. You'll often lose. But in the process, you form a sense of community. You have a cause which is righteous. You have meaning, a sense of coherence. Because when you're a kid and you're Oriental, as that term was still being used, in the 1970s in Detroit, you think there's something wrong with you. It's in your head. It's your fault, or it's your parents because they were Chinese, because they have accents, because they eat funny-looking food. But this moment, this is when you realize, no, American ideals are great, but sometimes we fall short. It's not our fault, and we can make a difference. We can change the world. So to me, to know that the Vincent Chin case was unresolved, that it didn't come to a satisfactory conclusion, that his grieving mother, who became a fixture on local television, asking, how could this happen? And saying candidly she wished she could kill her son's killers. To know that she went to her grave not seeing justice being done. It's these moments that make me determined to do better, for us to be organized, for us to assert in a principled way our power, that we are here, that we're here to stay, that we're equals, and that we will stand up and speak out. Thank you so much.